My son passed away and my daughter-in-law inherited the house and $17 million. I only inherited a small cabin in the countryside. Then she kicked me out of the house and said, "Now go live with the pigs, you useless old woman." Days later, I found something in the cabin that made her turn pale. It's not fair. I should be the one with this fortune. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I never imagined that burying my son would be easier than sitting in that lawyer's office 3 days later. The funeral had been a blur of black clothes and sympathetic faces, hands patting my shoulder, voices murmuring condolences that never quite reached my heart. My son, Liam Harris, gone at only 38. A heart attack, they said. So sudden, so final. I stood by his casket, my fingers trembling as I placed a single white rose atop it. Liam had always loved white roses. When he was a boy, he'd pick them from our garden and present them to me with that gap-toothed smile that could melt my heart in an instant. "Mom," he'd say, "these are almost as beautiful as you." Even at 7, he'd been a charmer. Now that smile was gone forever. Across the room, my daughter-in-law, Evelyn Carter Harris, stood surrounded by her friends. Tall, elegant, in a perfectly tailored black dress that probably cost more than my monthly pension. Her dark skin glowed even in grief, her makeup flawless despite the occasion. Something about her composure bothered me. There was a stiffness to her shoulders, a calculated precision to her movements that seemed rehearsed. But I dismissed it as shock. Everyone processes grief differently, I told myself. And Evelyn had lost her husband, after all. "Rebecca," I turned to find Pastor Williams at my side, his kind eyes filled with concern. "It's time for the eulogy," he said gently. I nodded, gathering my strength. I had raised Liam alone after his father David passed when Liam was just 10. We'd been through everything together: school troubles, first heartbreaks, college applications, his first job at that little tech startup that eventually grew into Harris Innovations. Now I had to say goodbye to my only child. As I walked to the podium, I caught Evelyn's eye. For just a moment, something flashed across her face. Not grief, not pain, something colder. But before I could process it, it was gone, replaced by a perfectly appropriate expression of sorrow. I spoke of my son's kindness, his brilliance, his sense of humor. I told the story of how he'd worked 3 jobs during college to pay for his education, how he'd built his company from nothing, how he'd never forgotten his roots despite his success. What I didn't say was how things had changed after he married Evelyn 4 years ago, how the weekly Sunday dinners had dwindled to monthly, then quarterly visits, how my calls increasingly went to voicemail, how Liam seemed different in those last months, distracted, anxious, sometimes looking over his shoulder as if expecting something unpleasant. After the service, Evelyn approached me, her arms outstretched for an embrace that felt hollow. "Rebecca," she said, her voice perfectly modulated for sympathy. "We'll get through this together." I nodded, unable to speak through the lump in my throat. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe someone cared about my pain. If only I'd known then what was coming. The lawyer's office felt too small, too warm, too real. Maxwell Thornton, Liam's attorney, sat behind his mahogany desk, a thick folder open before him. His silver-rimmed glasses reflected the afternoon sunlight as he cleared his throat. "Mrs. Harris, Mrs. Carter Harris, thank you for coming today. I know this is difficult, but we need to go through Liam's final wishes." I sat stiffly in the leather chair, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. Beside me, Evelyn shifted constantly, her manicured nails tapping against her designer purse. She'd been unusually quiet since we'd arrived, but I could feel the tension radiating from her like heat from a furnace. "Before we begin," Thornton continued, "I want to express my condolences. Liam was not only my client, but my friend. His loss is felt deeply by many." I nodded, fighting back tears. The doctor had said it was a genetic condition, something that could strike without warning. All those years I'd worried about car accidents or dangerous situations, never thinking his own heart would betray him. "Let's proceed," Thornton said, adjusting his glasses as he began to read from the document before him. "I, Liam David Harris, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament." The formal language washed over me, meaningless legal phrases that couldn't possibly capture my son's voice, his spirit, his love. "To my beloved wife, Evelyn," Thornton read, and I felt my stomach tighten. "I leave the family home at 1247 Oakwood Drive, along with all furnishings, vehicles, and the sum of $17 million from my investment accounts and life insurance policies." $17 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. Liam had built a successful tech consulting firm, but I'd never realized just how wealthy he'd become. Evelyn's sharp intake of breath told me she hadn't known either, but when I glanced at her, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Not surprise, but satisfaction, as if she'd been expecting this all along. The lawyer continued reading, but his voice seemed to fade into background noise. $17 million. And the house where I'd lived with Liam and his father for over 30 years. The house where I'd raised my son. Where I'd nursed my husband through his final illness. Where every room held memories of our family. And to my mother, Rebecca Harris, the lawyer's voice brought me back to the present. I leave the property located at 847 County Road 15, known as Willow Creek Cabin, along with all structures and contents therein. That was it. The entire reading took less than 10 minutes, and in that time, my whole world had been redistributed. Evelyn got millions and the home I'd lived in for 3 decades. I got a rundown cabin in the middle of nowhere that Liam's grandfather had built in the 1960s. Is that all?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. Thornton nodded sympathetically. "Your son was very specific about his wishes, Mrs. Harris. The cabin property includes 43 acres of land. 43 acres of worthless forest land with a cabin that hadn't been maintained in years. I'd been there maybe 5 times in my entire life, and each time I'd wondered why Liam's grandfather hadn't just sold the property." Evelyn finally spoke, her voice sickeningly sweet. "Oh, Rebecca, I'm sure Liam thought you'd love having a peaceful place to retire. You know how much you enjoy solitude." The way she said solitude made it sound like a character flaw. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something I'd been too grief-stricken to notice before. There was no sadness in her eyes, no trace of the devastation I felt at losing Liam. Instead, there was a cold calculation that made my skin crawl. "I suppose I should start looking for somewhere else to live," I said quietly, the reality of my situation sinking in. Evelyn's mask slipped just slightly. "Actually, Rebecca, I think it would be best if you moved to the cabin as soon as possible. I need time to process Liam's death in our home. Surely you understand." Our home. She'd already claimed it completely, erasing my 30 years there with 2 simple words: the drive back to Oakwood Drive, back to what I could no longer call home, passed in silence. Evelyn disappeared into the master bedroom immediately, leaving me standing alone in the living room where Liam had taken his first steps, where we'd celebrated every Christmas, where just last month he'd told me about the new contract that would secure his company's future. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house like a ghost, touching familiar objects that would soon belong to someone else. In Liam's office, I found myself staring at the family photos on his desk. There was one of him at 5 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a fish he'd caught at Willow Creek Cabin. I'd forgotten about that day until now. The memory brought fresh tears to my eyes. Liam had been so proud of that little fish, insisting we take a picture before throwing it back into the creek. "It deserves to grow up with its family. Mom," he'd said, my sweet, compassionate boy. What had happened? How could he leave me with nothing but a dilapidated cabin while giving everything to a woman who couldn't even shed a tear at his funeral as dawn broke? I had no answers, only a hollowness in my chest where my heart used to be. The next morning, Evelyn emerged from the master bedroom fully dressed, her hair and makeup perfect despite the early hour. She found me in the kitchen sitting at the table with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. "Rebecca," she said, her tone brisk and businesslike. "I've arranged for a moving company to help you pack. They'll be here this afternoon." This afternoon. I looked up at her in shock. "But I thought—" "I know this is hard," she interrupted, but her voice held no sympathy. "But honestly, staying here is just prolonging the grieving process for both of us. The cabin will be good for you. Fresh air, nature, time to reflect." She made it sound like a vacation instead of an exile. "Evelyn, please," I said, my voice breaking. "This is my home. I've lived here for 30 years. All my memories of Liam are here." Something hard flashed in her eyes. "It's not your home anymore, Rebecca. It's mine." The will was very clear on that point. I spent that morning packing 40 years of my life into cardboard boxes. The movers Evelyn had hired worked efficiently, loading my belongings into their truck with the indifference of people handling objects rather than memories. Every item I packed was a story, a piece of my life with my son, the handmade ceramic bowl he'd created in third-grade art class, the framed photo of us at his college graduation, his arm around my shoulders, both of us beaming with pride. The quilt my mother had made that had covered his bed throughout childhood. I kept expecting Evelyn to appear, to offer some small kindness or acknowledge what this move meant to me. Instead, she stayed locked in the master bedroom until it was time for me to leave. As I stood in the driveway watching the moving truck pull away, Evelyn finally emerged. She walked toward me with the measured steps of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. "I want you to know, Rebecca," she said, stopping just close enough that her words would cut deep, "that Liam and I discussed this. He felt it was time for you to have your own space. He was worried about you becoming too dependent." The lie was delivered with such practiced sincerity that for a moment I almost believed her. But I knew my son. I knew the relationship we'd had. This wasn't his voice speaking. This was Evelyn rewriting history to suit her narrative. "Now go live with the pigs, you useless old woman," she added, her mask finally dropping completely. "That cabin is exactly where you belong." The cruelty in her voice hit me like a slap. This was the woman my son had loved, had chosen to share his life with. This was the person he'd trusted with $17 million, and the home that held our family's entire history. I got into my car without responding. What could I say? The law was on her side. Liam's will was clear. I had no legal recourse. No way to fight what felt like the ultimate betrayal. As I drove away from Oakwood Drive for the last time, I caught sight of Evelyn in my rearview mirror. She was standing in the doorway of the house, watching me leave with an expression of unmistakable triumph. The drive to Willow Creek took 2 hours through increasingly rural roads. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the overgrown trees that surrounded the property. The structure looked even worse than I remembered. Weathered wood, a sagging porch, windows so dirty they were nearly opaque. This was my inheritance. This was what my son had thought I deserved. Standing there in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of the forest around me, I felt more alone than I ever had in my 64 years. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that something about all this didn't make sense. Why would Liam, who called me every Sunday and never missed my birthday, suddenly decide I needed to be isolated in the middle of nowhere? Why would he give his wife everything and leave me with practically nothing? I pulled out my phone to call him, forgetting for a moment that he was gone. The reality hit me again like a physical blow, but this time mixed with the grief was something else. Suspicion. The moving truck arrived at Willow Creek the next morning, looking absurdly out of place on the narrow dirt road. The driver took one look at the cabin and shook his head. "You sure this is the right address? Lady," I wanted to tell him no, that this had to be some terrible mistake, but instead, I just nodded and pointed toward the sagging porch. "Just put everything inside, please." It took the movers 3 hours to unload 40 years of my life into a space that felt like it could barely contain 4 decades of dust. My beautiful dining room set looked ridiculous in the small main room. My china cabinet, which had belonged to my grandmother, stood awkwardly against a wall of knotty pine that hadn't been stained since the Carter administration. After the movers left, I stood surrounded by boxes, feeling completely overwhelmed. The cabin had electricity, barely, and running water that came out brown for the first few minutes. The heat came from an old wood-burning stove that I had no idea how to operate. This wasn't retirement. This was exile. I spent the first night on an air mattress, too exhausted to set up my bed frame. Every sound made me jump. The settling of old wood, the scurrying of what I hoped were just mice, the wind whistling through gaps in the walls I hadn't noticed during the day. By morning, I'd made a decision. I would clean this place up and sell it as quickly as possible. 43 acres had to be worth something, and whatever I could get would help me find a small apartment somewhere civilized. I started in the main room, unpacking boxes and trying to arrange my furniture in a way that made sense. That's when I found the first strange thing. A box I didn't remember packing tucked behind my couch. When I opened it, I found old photographs and documents that had belonged to my late husband, David. David had died 8 years ago, and I thought I'd gone through all his papers. These must have been stored somewhere in Liam's house that I'd forgotten about. As I sifted through the yellow documents, I found insurance papers, old tax returns, and at the bottom, something that made my hands tremble. A deed to the Willow Creek property, but not the one I'd expected to see. This deed was different from the one the lawyer had shown me. It was older, dating back to when David's father had first purchased the land in 1962. According to this document, the property wasn't just 43 acres of forest. The original survey showed mineral rights, oil and gas leases, technical terms I didn't understand, but which filled me with a strange mixture of hope and confusion. I set the document aside, telling myself it probably didn't mean anything. Mineral rights to land that had never produced anything were essentially worthless, but something about finding these papers in a box I didn't remember packing bothered me. I was still thinking about it when I heard a car approaching. Through the dirty window, I watched a sleek black sedan navigate the rutted driveway. My heart sank as I recognized the driver. Evelyn stepped out of the car wearing designer jeans and boots that probably cost more than I'd spent on groceries in the past month. She looked around with obvious distaste, picking her way carefully toward the cabin as if the ground might contaminate her. "Rebecca," she called out in that false, sweet voice she'd perfected. "I thought I'd check on how you're settling in." I opened the door, not bothering to invite her inside. "What do you want, Evelyn?" "I brought you some things from the house," she said, holding up a small cardboard box. "Some of Liam's old clothes and a few items I thought you might want." She pushed past me into the cabin, and I saw her eyes scanning everything with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. This wasn't a casual visit from a concerned daughter-in-law. This was an inspection. "It's rustic," she said, setting the box down on my kitchen counter. "I'm sure you'll grow to love it here. All this nature. Why are you really here, Evelyn?" She turned to face me, and for just a moment, her mask slipped. "I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed, that you weren't missing anything. Important." The way she emphasized important made my skin crawl. Her eyes kept darting around the room, and I realized she was looking for something specific. "Like what?" I pressed. "Oh, documents, papers, anything that might have gotten mixed up during the move." She moved toward the box I'd found behind the couch, but I stepped between her and it. "I can't imagine what papers of mine would concern you." Evelyn's smile became strained. "Of course not. I just want to make sure there aren't any loose ends. Legal matters can be so complicated when someone dies." She stayed for another 20 minutes, making awkward small talk while her eyes continued to search the room. When she finally left, I felt like I could breathe again. But her visit had accomplished one thing. It had confirmed my growing suspicion that something wasn't right about Liam's will or my inheritance. That evening, I went through the box of David's papers more carefully. Most of it was routine. Old insurance policies, warranty information for appliances we'd replaced years ago, receipts for home repairs. But at the very bottom, wrapped in a rubber band, I found something that made my heart race. A letter addressed to me in Liam's handwriting. My hand shook as I opened it. The letter was dated just 3 months before Liam's death. "Mom, if you're reading this, something has happened to me, and you're probably confused about why I left you the cabin. I know it doesn't seem like much compared to what Evelyn inherited, but I need you to trust me. The cabin is more important than it appears. Look in Dad's old toolbox in the shed. There's something there you need to find. And Mom, be careful who you trust. Not everything is what it seems. Love, Liam. I read the letter 3 times before it fully sank in. Liam had known something might happen to him. He'd planned for this. But what was in David's toolbox? And why had Liam hidden this letter among his father's papers instead of with the will? I looked out at the darkening forest surrounding the cabin. Somewhere out there was a shed I hadn't even explored yet. And in that shed, apparently, were answers to questions I didn't even know I should be asking. The realization hit me like a bolt of electricity. Evelyn's visit hadn't been about concern or loose ends. She'd been looking for this letter or something like it. She'd been searching for evidence of whatever Liam had discovered. As I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my pocket, I felt something I hadn't experienced in days. Hope, mixed with that hope, though, was a growing dread. If Liam had felt the need to hide a message for me, if he'd been worried enough to write that letter 3 months before his death, then what exactly had he stumbled upon? And more importantly, what was Evelyn so desperate to find? The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows of the old cabin, but for the first time since Liam's funeral, I didn't feel afraid. I felt determined. Tomorrow, I would find that toolbox. I barely slept that night. Liam's letter felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket, and every creak of the old cabin made me wonder if Evelyn had come back. By dawn, I was dressed and ready to search for David's toolbox. The shed stood about 50 yards behind the cabin, half hidden by overgrown bushes and leaning slightly to one side like it might collapse at any moment. The door stuck, swollen from years of moisture, and I had to put my full weight behind it to get it open. Inside, everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. Rusty garden tools hung from hooks on the walls, and wooden shelves held paint cans so old their labels had faded to illegibility. It looked like no one had been in here for years. But there in the far corner sat David's red metal toolbox, the same one he'd carried to every home repair project for 30 years. My throat tightened with memories of watching him fix leaky faucets and squeaky hinges. Always patient, always thorough. The toolbox was heavier than I remembered, and it took both hands to lift it onto the workbench. The latches were corroded but still functional. When I opened it, the familiar smell of metal and old oil hit me along with something else. The faint scent of David's cologne that had somehow lingered all these years. The top tray held the usual assortment of screwdrivers, wrenches, and measuring tape. But when I lifted it out, I found something underneath that definitely hadn't been there when David was alive. A manila envelope thick with documents and a small brass key attached to a piece of string. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. The first document was a geological survey of the Willow Creek property dated just 6 months before Liam's death. Technical language filled the pages, but certain phrases jumped out at me. Significant petroleum deposits. Estimated reserves. Commercial viability confirmed. The next document was even more shocking. A letter from Blackstone Energy Corporation offering to purchase the mineral rights to the property for $50 million. $50 million. I had to read it 3 times before the number felt real. The letter was addressed to Liam, dated 2 months before his death, and marked urgent response required. But that wasn't the most devastating discovery. At the bottom of the envelope was a copy of Liam's real will, not the one read in the lawyer's office, but a different version dated 1 week before his death. In this will, everything was reversed. The cabin and its mineral rights were left to me, along with detailed instructions about the oil deposits and the pending offer from Blackstone Energy. Evelyn was left with only the house and a modest trust fund of $200,000. Attached to this will was a note in Liam's handwriting. Mom, I discovered Evelyn has been slowly poisoning me. I have proof, but I'm not sure how much time I have. If something happens to me, this is your insurance policy. The key opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank. Box 247. Everything you need is there. I love you. Mom, the world seemed to tilt around me. I gripped the edge of the workbench to keep from falling as the implications crashed over me like a wave. Evelyn had murdered my son. She had poisoned him slowly, methodically, while he figured out her plan and tried to protect me from beyond the grave. And somehow she had managed to substitute a fake will for the real one, stealing both Liam's life and his intended legacy. The key felt impossibly heavy in my palm, a box 247 at First National Bank. Whatever Liam had discovered about Evelyn's crimes was waiting there. I was so absorbed in the documents that I didn't hear the car approaching until it was too late. Through the grimy shed window, I saw Evelyn's black sedan pulling up beside the cabin. My heart hammered against my ribs as I quickly stuffed everything back into the envelope and shoved it under the toolbox. By the time I emerged from the shed, trying to look casual, Evelyn was standing on the cabin's porch with two men in expensive suits. "Rebecca," she called out, her voice bright with false cheer. "Perfect timing. I've brought some people who want to meet you." I walked toward them slowly, the brass key clutched in my fist behind my back. "What's this about?" "Well, these gentlemen represent a development company," Evelyn explained, gesturing to the taller of the two men. "They're interested in purchasing your property." The man stepped forward with a predatory smile. "Mrs. Harris, I'm James Hutchkins from Riverside Development. We specialize in converting rural properties into residential communities. Your 43 acres would be perfect for our next project. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer," the second man added. $75,000 cash. With a quick closing, you could be out of this rustic situation within a week. $75,000 for property that Blackstone Energy wanted to pay $50 million for. I looked at Evelyn, who was watching me with barely concealed anxiety. She needed me to sell this land, and she needed it to happen before I discovered what Liam had left for me. "That's very generous," I said carefully. "But I'm not interested in selling right now. I'm just getting settled." Hutchkins exchanged a glance with his partner. "Mrs. Harris, I don't think you understand the reality of your situation. This property needs significant work to be habitable long-term. The plumbing, the electrical system, the structural integrity of the cabin. You're looking at tens of thousands in repairs. And let's be honest," Evelyn added with false sympathy. "At your age, living out here alone isn't practical. What if you had a medical emergency? What if something happened and no one could find you for days?" The threat was subtle but unmistakable. I was 64 years old, living alone in an isolated cabin with no close neighbors and spotty cell phone service. If someone wanted to make me disappear, this would be the perfect place to do it. "I appreciate your concern," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "But I'm not ready to make any decisions about the property yet." Hutchkins's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened. "Perhaps you'd like to take a day or two to think it over. We'll be staying at the Pine View Motel in town if you change your mind." After they left, I sat in the cabin staring at the brass key, my mind racing. Evelyn wasn't just a gold digger who had married Liam for his money. She was a calculating murderer who had planned everything from the beginning. The fake will, the rushed sale of the mineral rights, even my isolation at the cabin. It was all part of her scheme. But Liam had been smarter than she'd given him credit for. Even while she was poisoning him, he'd managed to gather evidence and create a backup plan. The real question was, how much time did I have before Evelyn realized I'd found it? I looked out at the gathering dusk, knowing that tomorrow I would drive to First National Bank and open that safety deposit box. Whatever Liam had left there would give me the weapons I needed to fight back. But tonight, alone in the cabin with only the wind for company, I couldn't shake the feeling that Evelyn already suspected I knew more than I was letting on. The game had begun, and I was no longer the grieving mother who could be easily dismissed. I was a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. And Evelyn had no idea what was coming. The drive to First National Bank took me through the small town where Liam had grown up, past the elementary school where he'd learned to read, and the park where we'd spent countless Saturday afternoons. Every familiar sight felt different now, colored by the knowledge of what Evelyn had done to him. The bank sat on Main Street, a solid brick building that had been there since the 1940s. I'd had an account there for over 30 years, but I'd never rented a safety deposit box. My hands shook slightly as I approached the receptionist. "I need to access safety deposit box 247, I said, producing the brass key and the copy of Liam's real will that established my legal right to the contents. The bank manager, Grace Chen reviewed the documents with the careful attention of someone who'd seen plenty of family drama played out in her office. She was in her 50s, with intelligent eyes behind stylish glasses, and I remembered her daughter had been in the same grade as Liam. "Rebecca," she said softly, recognition dawning in her eyes. "I heard about Liam. I'm so sorry." "Thank you, Grace," I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady. After 20 minutes of verification calls and paperwork, she led me down a narrow staircase to the vault. "Take as much time as you need, Mrs. Harris," she said, sliding the metal box from its slot. "Ring the bell when you're finished." Alone in the small viewing room, I lifted the lid of the safety deposit box with trembling fingers. Inside was a world of evidence that Liam had carefully assembled in his final months, a paper trail that would destroy Evelyn completely. The first item was a thick folder labeled Medical Evidence. It contained copies of Liam's medical records from his regular doctor, along with reports from a private lab that had analyzed his hair and blood samples. The results showed consistent levels of thallium, a heavy metal that, when administered in small doses over time, could cause heart failure while being nearly undetectable. Thallium poisoning. That's how Evelyn had murdered my son. The next folder contained financial records showing that Evelyn had been systematically moving money from Liam's accounts into offshore holdings in her name. Over the past year, she'd transferred nearly $3 million, always in amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements. But the most damning evidence was in the third folder surveillance footage. Liam had installed hidden cameras in their home after he began suspecting Evelyn. The USB drive contained hours of footage showing her adding something to his coffee each morning, crushing pills into his dinner, even injecting something into his insulin pen when he'd been briefly diabetic the year before. There were also audio recordings, conversations where Evelyn spoke to someone on the phone about the old woman and how I needed to be handled after Liam was gone. The voice on the other end was male, and while I couldn't identify it, the conversations made it clear that Evelyn had an accomplice. "The cabin situation is temporary." Evelyn's voice came through clearly on one recording. "Once we get her to sign over the mineral rights, she won't be a problem anymore." "And if she won't sign," the man's voice asked, "then we'll have to convince her one way or another." The threat was unmistakable. They were planning to kill me, too. The final item in the box was a letter addressed to the FBI, already stamped and ready to mail. Liam had prepared everything. All I had to do was drop it in a mailbox and federal agents would begin investigating Evelyn for murder, fraud, and conspiracy. But as I sat in that small room surrounded by evidence of my son's murder, I realized I wanted more than justice. I wanted Evelyn to know that she'd been outplayed. I wanted her to experience the same fear and helplessness she'd put Liam through in his final months. I photographed everything with my phone, then carefully returned the originals to the safety deposit box. The letter to the FBI would stay there for now, my insurance policy, in case something happened to me. The drive back to the cabin gave me time to plan. Evelyn expected me to be a helpless old woman, easily manipulated and disposed of. I would let her continue thinking that while I prepared my counterstrike. That evening, I spread out the papers from the shed on the kitchen table, paying particular attention to the real will. Unlike the one read in Thornton's office, this will was handwritten, dated just 1 week before Liam's death, and notarized by someone named Walter Jenkins. In this will, Liam left me the cabin and its mineral rights, with explicit instructions to contact Blackstone Energy about their offer. He left Evelyn the house on Oakwood Drive and a trust fund of $200,000 generous enough not to raise suspicions, but nothing compared to the millions she'd expected. But what struck me most was the letter attached to the will. "Mom, by the time you read this, I'll probably be gone. I've suspected for months that Evelyn has been poisoning me, but it took time to gather proof. I've been secretly seeing specialists, getting tests done, collecting evidence. The symptoms started small fatigue, hair loss, stomach pain, but they've gotten worse. The doctors finally identified thallium in my system. I confronted Evelyn last week. She denied everything. Of course, but I saw it in her eyes. She knows I know. That's why I'm writing this new will and hiding it where she can't find it. I've created a safety deposit box with all the evidence, medical reports, bank statements showing money she's been stealing, and recordings from cameras I installed in our house. I don't think I have much time left. The damage to my heart is extensive, and the doctors say a heart attack is likely. I've told no one except you, through this letter, because I don't know who I can trust. Evelyn has friends in high places, including at my company. The cabin may seem like a small inheritance, but the land sits on one of the largest undeveloped oil deposits in the state. Blackstone Energy has offered $50 million for the mineral rights alone. This is your security. Mom, this is my way of making sure you're taken care of when I'm gone. Watch out for Evelyn. She's more dangerous than I ever imagined. Once she realizes what's happening, she'll come after you and the cabin. Be careful, but be strong. You've always been the strongest person I know. I love you. Mom, I'm sorry I didn't see the truth about Evelyn sooner. Liam, I read the letter twice, tears streaming down my face. My son had spent his final months fighting a battle I knew nothing about, protecting me even as his own life slipped away. The anger that rose in me then was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. A cold, clear fury that gave me perfect clarity. Evelyn Carter Harris had killed my son for money. She had manipulated the will, thrown me out of my home, and was now trying to steal the only valuable thing Liam had left me. She would pay for that, not just with prison time, but with the knowledge that she'd been outsmarted by the useless old woman she'd so easily dismissed. I was almost back to the cabin when my phone rang. Evelyn's name flashed on the screen and I let it go to voicemail. When I played the message back, her voice was tight with barely controlled panic. Rebecca, it's me. Those developers called. They're increasing their offer to $100,000, but only if you decide by tomorrow. I really think you should consider it. This property is just too much for you to handle alone. $100,000. Still a fraction of what the land was really worth. But the increased urgency told me everything I needed to know. Something had spooked them. Maybe they'd discovered that I'd been to the bank, or maybe they were just getting nervous about how long this was taking. Either way, it was time to force their hand. I called Evelyn back, injecting just the right amount of weariness into my voice. I got your message. You're right. This place is too much for me. I think I'm ready to sell. The relief in her voice was palpable. Oh, Rebecca, I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this. Should I call the developers? Actually, I was hoping you could bring them by tomorrow morning. I'd like to discuss the terms in person before I sign anything. Of course. What time works for you? How about 10:30? That will give me time to have my coffee and get my thoughts together. Perfect. And Rebecca, I'm really proud of you for making this decision. Liam would want you to be comfortable and secure. The casual invocation of my murdered son's name made my blood boil, but I kept my voice steady. Yes, I think he would. After I hung up, I spent the evening preparing. I cleaned the cabin thoroughly, arranged my furniture to create clear sight lines to all the windows, and set up my phone to record everything that was about to happen. Then I sat down and wrote my own letter, not to the FBI, but to the local sheriff's department. I explained everything I'd discovered, attached copies of the evidence from the safety deposit box, and sealed it in an envelope addressed to Sheriff Frank Morrison, a man I'd known since he was Liam's classmate in high school. If something went wrong tomorrow, if Evelyn's threats turned violent, at least the truth would survive. But I had one more errand before morning. Despite the darkness and the late hour, I drove into town and dropped the letter in the mailbox outside the sheriff's office. I couldn't risk Evelyn or her accomplices intercepting it if they arrived early. As I drove back to the cabin through the quiet night, I felt strangely calm. For the first time since Liam's death, I had purpose, I had clarity, and most importantly, I had truth on my side. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, perfectly matching my mood. I made coffee and toast, going through the motions of a normal breakfast while my heart hammered against my ribs. At exactly 10 Hoosiers, I heard cars approaching. Through the window, I watched 3 vehicles pull up. Evelyn's sedan, a white SUV carrying the 2 fake developers, and a third car I didn't recognize. 4 people got out instead of the expected 3. The 4th person was a woman in her 50s, professionally dressed, carrying a briefcase. She had the look of someone who'd done this before, someone who specialized in making inconvenient people disappear. My phone was already recording as they approached the cabin. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and smiled as if I were genuinely happy to see them. "Good morning, everyone. Please come in." As they filed into my small living room, I saw Evelyn's eyes scanning for any sign that I'd discovered her secrets. She was nervous, but not panicked. Not yet. "Rebecca," she said, "I'd like you to meet Sarah Martinez. She's a notary who will help us make everything official." Martinez nodded professionally. "Mrs. Harris, I understand you're ready to sell your property. Do you have any questions about the paperwork?" "Just one," I said, settling into my armchair with the calm of someone who held all the cards. "I'm curious about why you're all so interested in 43 acres of worthless forest land." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Hutchkins and his partner exchanged glances while Evelyn's smile became noticeably strained. "It's not worthless, Mrs. Harris," Hutchkins said carefully. "As I mentioned, it has development potential." "Oh, I see. And that development potential wouldn't have anything to do with the $50 million worth of oil deposits under my property, would it?" The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn went pale, and Martinez actually took a step backward toward the door. I pulled out my phone and held it up. "Did you know this has been recording our entire conversation, including the part where you all conspired to defraud me out of $50 million? Evelyn's composure finally cracked completely. "You don't know what you're doing, Rebecca. You're in over your head. Am I because it seems to me like I know exactly what I'm doing? Just like my son knew what he was doing when he hid evidence of his own murder." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Evelyn's face cycled through shock, fear, and finally cold calculation. "I don't know what you think you found," she began. "I found everything. Evelyn, the thallium poisoning, the forged will, the offshore accounts, the surveillance footage, all of it." Martinez was already heading for the door, clearly wanting no part of whatever was about to happen. Hutchkins and his partner weren't far behind her, but Evelyn stepped closer, and for the first time, I saw the real woman beneath the mask, the cold-blooded killer who had methodically murdered my son. "You can't prove anything," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I smiled, feeling truly calm for the first time in weeks. "Actually, Evelyn, I can prove everything. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" The fake developers and the notary were already in their cars, engines running. When Evelyn turned back to face me, her mask had completely fallen away now, revealing the predator underneath. The woman who had smiled sweetly at Liam's funeral was gone, replaced by someone whose eyes held nothing but cold calculation. "You think you're so clever," she said, stepping closer to where I sat in my armchair. "But you're just a foolish old woman who doesn't understand the game she's playing." I kept my phone positioned to capture everything, my finger hovering over the emergency call button. "I understand perfectly. You murdered my son for money, and now you want to kill me too." "Liam was weak," she spat, her voice dripping with contempt. "He actually believed in love and family. He never saw what was right in front of him until it was too late. He saw enough. He gathered evidence, changed his will. Made sure you'd never get away with this." Evelyn laughed, but it was a harsh, brittle sound. "Evidence. You mean that pathetic collection of papers he thought he was hiding so cleverly? Did you really think I didn't know about his little spy cameras and his secret trips to doctors?" My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" "I've known about Liam's investigation for months. Every doctor he visited, every test he ran, every piece of evidence he thought he was gathering. I was 3 steps ahead of him the entire time." She pulled out her phone and scrolled through what looked like a series of text messages. "Dr. Henderson was very cooperative once I explained the situation to him. Amazing how quickly medical professionals will falsify records when their own families are threatened." The implications hit me like a physical blow. If Evelyn had known about Liam's investigation, if she'd been manipulating the evidence from the beginning, the medical records in the safety deposit box, I whispered, completely fabricated, the blood tests showing thallium fake, the hair samples tampered with, even those surveillance videos you're so proud of, I made sure Liam's cameras captured exactly what I wanted them to capture. My hands started shaking as the full scope of her deception became clear. "You let him think he was building a case against you." "I encouraged it. Poor Liam, so desperate to protect his mommy." He had no idea that every piece of evidence he collected was actually strengthening my position. When the authorities eventually investigate his death, and they will, thanks to all his paranoid preparations, they'll find a mentally unstable man who was convinced his loving wife was trying to poison him. She moved to the window, looking out at the empty driveway where the other cars had disappeared. The tragic truth will be that Liam suffered a psychotic break in his final months. Paranoid delusions, wild accusations, secret meetings with doctors who will testify that he was exhibiting signs of severe mental illness. But the will, the real will that leaves me everything. Also fate, I had Liam create that secret will himself, convinced him it was necessary to protect you from me. He wrote it in his own handwriting, signed it willingly, even had it notarized by someone who will swear Liam seemed perfectly rational at the time. The room seemed to spin around me. Every piece of evidence I thought I had, every weapon Liam had left me to fight with. All of it was part of Evelyn's elaborate trap. The best part, she continued, her voice taking on an almost dreamy quality, is that Liam died believing he'd outwitted me. In his final moments, when the massive heart attack hit, he probably felt satisfied knowing that his dear mother would be protected. I felt sick to my stomach. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to understand how completely you've lost before I finish what I started. She turned back to face me, and I saw something in her eyes that made my skin crawl. Liam wasn't the only one who underestimated me. Rebecca, you did too. She walked to the kitchen and opened the cabinet where I kept my coffee mugs. Did you enjoy your coffee this morning? I noticed you made a fresh pot before we arrived. Very hospitable of you. The mug I'd used for breakfast was still sitting in the sink, and suddenly I understood why I'd been feeling slightly dizzy since they'd arrived. The room seemed to tilt, and I gripped the arms of my chair to steady myself. What did you do? The same thing I did to Liam, just much faster. Concentrated thallium solution, completely tasteless, virtually undetectable, unless you know exactly what to look for. She checked her watch. You've got maybe 20 minutes before the heart palpitations start, 30 minutes after that. Complete cardiac arrest. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't support me. The phone slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the floor. The beautiful irony, Evelyn said, settling into the chair across from me as if we were having a pleasant conversation, is that everyone will believe you committed suicide. A grieving mother, overwhelmed by financial problems and living alone in this depressing cabin. It writes itself. She pulled a piece of paper from her purse and placed it on the coffee table between us. Even through my growing confusion, I could see it was a suicide note written in what looked remarkably like my handwriting. I can't go on without Liam, she read aloud. The guilt of knowing I failed him as a mother is too much to bear. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused everyone. Very touching, don't you think? My vision was starting to blur, but I forced myself to focus. There had to be something, some way to fight back. The recording on my phone. But even as I thought it, I realized Evelyn was right. Who would believe a recording made by a woman everyone would think was mentally unstable? The property will go to Liam's estate, of course, she continued conversationally. As his widow, I'll inherit everything, including those valuable mineral rights. Blackstone Energy is prepared to pay $60 million now. Apparently, the deposits are even larger than originally estimated. $60 million. My son had died for $60 million. You won't get away with this, I managed to whisper, though even forming the words was becoming difficult. I already have gotten away with it. Liam's death was ruled natural causes. Your death will be ruled suicide, and I'll be the grieving widow who lost both her husband and her mother-in-law to tragic circumstances beyond anyone's control. She stood up and walked to the door. I'm going to leave now. Rebecca, when they find you tomorrow, I'll be at the spa in town getting a massage and building an alibi. By the time anyone thinks to question me, all the evidence will point to a depressed old woman who couldn't handle her grief. The cabin door opened, letting in a gust of cold air that made me shiver. Or maybe that was the poison working its way through my system. Goodbye, Rebecca. I'd say I'm sorry it had to end this way, but we both know that would be a lie. The door slammed shut, and I heard her car starting up outside. Within moments, the sound of her engine faded into the distance, leaving me alone with the growing certainty that I was going to die. But as I sat there fighting against the fog that was clouding my thoughts, I remembered something Evelyn didn't know about. Something I'd done that morning before anyone arrived. The letter I'd written to Sheriff Morrison wasn't sitting on my kitchen counter where I'd left it. It was already in the mail, dropped into the post office box in town during my early morning drive. Sheriff Morrison would receive that letter tomorrow, along with copies of everything I'd found in the safety deposit box. Even if Evelyn had manipulated the original evidence, my letter would raise enough questions to trigger a real investigation. It wasn't much, but it was something. As my heart began to race erratically and the room spun around me, I held on to that single thought. Evelyn thought she'd won, but she'd made one critical mistake. She'd underestimated a mother's love for her child. And now, even if I didn't survive, she was going to pay for what she'd done to Liam. The room was spinning violently now, and my heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. Each breath was a struggle, and I could feel my body shutting down just as Evelyn had planned. But in those moments when I expected to slip into unconsciousness, something extraordinary happened. My phone, which had fallen to the floor during Evelyn's confession, began ringing with an incoming call. The sound seemed to pierce through the fog in my brain, and I realized I wasn't as far gone as I'd thought. With enormous effort, I managed to slide out of the chair and crawl toward the phone. The caller ID showed Sheriff Morrison's name, my letter. Somehow he'd gotten it early. "Mrs. Harris," his voice crackled through the speaker when I managed to answer. "Poisoned," I gasped into the phone. "Evelyn, she just left. Thallium in my coffee. Jesus Christ, I'm sending an ambulance right now. Stay on the line with me. Rebecca." The next few minutes were a blur of sirens, paramedics, and the strange sensation of being lifted onto a stretcher, but I remained conscious, fighting against the poison with a determination I didn't know I still possessed. It turned out that Evelyn had made a crucial miscalculation. In her arrogance, she'd assumed that a 64-year-old woman would succumb to the same dose that had killed my son. But I was smaller than Liam, and ironically, a lifetime of drinking strong coffee had given me a tolerance for certain toxins that she hadn't accounted for. The emergency room doctors pumped my stomach and started chelation therapy to remove the heavy metals from my system. It was touch and go for several hours, but by evening they told me I was going to make a full recovery. Sheriff Morrison was waiting by my hospital bed when I woke up the next morning. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his expression grim, like I've been run over by a truck. "But alive." He nodded. "Rebecca, I need you to tell me everything that happened yesterday. Everything Evelyn said. Everything she admitted to." I told him the whole story, from finding Liam's letter in the toolbox to Evelyn's confession about manipulating all the evidence. Morrison took careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification. "The problem we have," he said when I'd finished, "is that most of what she told you about falsifying the medical records, manipulating the will, even the surveillance footage might actually be true. If she's been planning this for as long as she claims, she could have covered her tracks very thoroughly." My heart sank. "So, she's going to get away with murdering Liam." "Not necessarily." Morrison's expression shifted, becoming almost predatory. "You see, the thing about people like Evelyn is that they're often too clever for their own good. She manipulated evidence to make it look like Liam was paranoid and mentally unstable, but she had to leave some traces of her activities to make that story believable." He pulled out a folder thick with documents. "After I got your letter yesterday, I started making some calls. Turns out the FBI has been watching Evelyn for months as part of a larger investigation into a network of people who specialize in marrying wealthy individuals and then, well, becoming widows. She's done this before, 3 times that we know of. Each time the husband died of apparent natural causes, leaving everything to his grieving wife. Each time there were just enough suspicious circumstances to raise questions, but never enough evidence to prosecute." Morrison flipped through the papers in his folder, but this time she got sloppy. Maybe it was because she was dealing with you as well as Liam. Or maybe she was just overconfident. Either way, she made mistakes. "What kind of mistakes?" "Well, for starters, she tried to poison you with the same method she used on Liam. The FBI has been monitoring her communications for weeks. They heard her discussing the old woman problem with her accomplice. You mean they recorded her planning to kill me? They recorded everything. Her phone calls, her meetings with those fake developers, even her conversation with the notary who helped forge the sale documents. Morrison smiled grimly. The woman you met yesterday wasn't really a notary. She was an undercover federal agent. The revelation hit me like a lightning bolt. The FBI knew what was happening. They've been building a case against Evelyn's entire operation for over a year. When they learned she was planning to eliminate you, they decided it was time to move. The problem was they needed her to actually commit a crime they could witness directly. So, they used you as bait. Morrison's expression became uncomfortable. They had agents positioned around the cabin yesterday, ready to intervene if things went too far. But when you managed to survive the poisoning and record her confession, he gestured to my phone, which was sitting on the bedside table. Well, let's just say you've given them everything they need to put her away for life. Where is she now? In federal custody. She was arrested this morning at the spa where she was building her alibi. Turns out the FBI had been watching that location, too. For the first time since Liam's death, I felt something like peace wash over me. It wasn't happiness. I don't think I'll ever be truly happy again without my son, but it was the satisfaction of knowing that justice would be served. What happens now? I asked. Morrison's face softened. Now you rest and recover. And when you're ready, we'll need your testimony to make sure Evelyn and everyone involved in this never see the outside of a prison again. I nodded, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had kept me going was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. Thank you, Frank, I said softly. For believing me, for helping me. He squeezed my hand gently. Liam was my friend, Rebecca. I couldn't save him, but I could at least make sure his mother was protected. As Morrison left, I closed my eyes, thinking of Liam, my brilliant, kind son who had tried so hard to protect me, even as his own life was being stolen from him. I hoped that somehow, wherever he was, he knew that his killer would face justice, and that his mother had turned out to be stronger than anyone, including Evelyn Carter Harris, had ever expected. Over the next several days, as I recovered in the hospital, the full scope of Evelyn's crimes became clear. Special Agent Thomas Ramirez, the FBI's lead investigator on the case, visited me on my third day of recovery. He was a serious man in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair and the watchful eyes of someone who'd seen the worst humanity had to offer. Mrs. Harris, he said, taking a seat beside my hospital bed, I want to apologize for what you went through. Using you as bait was not our first choice. But Evelyn Carter was extremely careful. We needed her to make a move we could document. I studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity but finding none. You could have warned me. We considered it, he admitted. But our profilers believed that your genuine fear and surprise would be more convincing to Evelyn. If you'd known we were watching, you might have unconsciously given something away. So you let me walk into a situation where I could have died. Agent Ramirez had the decency to look uncomfortable. We had agents in the woods surrounding the cabin. 2 were dressed as hikers, one as a utility worker checking lines down the road. The moment Evelyn put something in your coffee, we had probable cause to intervene. But we needed to let the situation develop enough to catch her in the act. And if I had taken a bigger sip if the poison had worked faster. We had a medical team standing by with chelation therapy equipment, the same treatment you received at the hospital. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. Mrs. Harris, I understand your anger, but what you need to know is that Evelyn Carter is part of a larger network we've been tracking for years. Your son wasn't her first victim. This caught my attention. Morrison mentioned she'd done this before. Ramirez nodded, pulling out a tablet. He swiped through a series of photographs, 3 men of varying ages, all successful-looking, all dead. Dr. Alexander Green, a renowned neurologist from Atlanta, died of apparent brain aneurysm 3 years ago at age 42. Left everything to his wife of 2 years, Evelyn Green, born Evelyn Carter. He swiped to the next photo. Marcus Wilson, real estate developer in Miami, heart failure at 45, less than a year after marrying Evelyn Wilson. Another swipe. Jason Chen, tech executive in San Francisco. Sudden cardiac arrest at 40 after 18 months of marriage to Evelyn Chen. I stared at the images, feeling sick. She's been doing this for years. At least 6 years that we can document. Possibly longer. Ramirez put the tablet down. What makes Evelyn unusual is that she doesn't just kill for inheritance. She seems to enjoy the process, the slow poisoning, watching her victims deteriorate while thinking they're simply ill. In psychological terms, we believe she displays characteristics of a malignant narcissist with sadistic tendencies. And the men she worked with at my cabin, James Hutchkins and Marcus Foster, are part of her network. They aren't killers themselves, but they facilitate the property transfers, create fake documentation, and help launder the money. We've had them under surveillance for months. I thought about what might have happened if I hadn't found Liam's letter, if I hadn't discovered the truth about the cabin. How many others have they killed? We've identified 12 victims across 7 states. Evelyn is directly linked to 4 of them, including your son. Ramirez's expression darkened. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the level of planning involved. These aren't crimes of passion or opportunity. They're meticulously orchestrated over months or years. She told me she knew Liam was investigating her, that she manipulated the evidence he was gathering. Ramirez nodded. That fits with her profile. Evelyn doesn't just want to kill her victims. She wants to control the narrative. She wants them to die believing they failed. But she didn't account for me, I said softly. For the first time. Ramirez smiled. No, Mrs. Harris. She didn't. In all our psychological profiles of Evelyn, we never predicted she would underestimate a grieving mother's determination. You've given us something we've been searching for: direct evidence of her confession. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a document. This is a formal request for your cooperation as a witness in the federal case against Evelyn Carter and her associates. Your testimony, combined with the recording you made and our surveillance, will ensure she never hurts anyone again. I took the paper, scanning the legal language. What happens now? Evelyn, Hutchkins, and Foster are in federal custody. The preliminary hearings begin next week, though the actual trial may be months away. In the meantime, he handed me a business card. This is the contact information for our victim services coordinator. They can help with protective measures, counseling, anything you might need. As Ramirez prepared to leave, I asked the question that had been nagging at me. Agent Ramirez, if you knew what Evelyn was doing, why didn't you stop her before she killed my son? His face fell, the professional mask slipping to reveal genuine regret. We didn't make the connection to Liam until it was too late. Evelyn used different methods with each victim, different jurisdictions. It wasn't until we identified the pattern with Jason Chen's death that we realized what we were dealing with. He placed a hand on my shoulder. I'm truly sorry we couldn't save your son, Mrs. Harris. But thanks to you, Evelyn's killing spree is over. No other mother will have to endure what you've been through. After he left, I lay back against the hospital pillows, processing everything I'd learned. Liam hadn't just been married to a gold digger. He'd been targeted by a serial killer, a woman who had perfected her craft through multiple murders. The knowledge didn't ease my grief, but it strengthened my resolve. I would testify. I would face Evelyn in court, and I would make sure the world knew exactly what she had done. Dr. Amara Patel, the hospital's trauma psychologist, came to see me the next day. She was a petite woman with kind eyes and a gentle voice that somehow cut through all my defenses. Mrs. Harris, she said, settling into the chair beside my bed. The medical team has asked me to speak with you about what you've experienced. I'm fine, I said automatically. Dr. Patel smiled softly. With all due respect, you've lost your son, been evicted from your home, poisoned, and learned that your daughter-in-law is a serial killer. Fine isn't a word I'd associate with those circumstances. Her directness startled a laugh out of me, the first genuine laugh since Liam's death. Well, when you put it that way. Over the next hour, Dr. Patel guided me through a conversation about grief, trauma, and healing. She didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances, just a framework for understanding my own reactions. What you're experiencing is a complex trauma, she explained. The loss of your son alone would be devastating, But the betrayal and violence you faced compounds that grief. It's normal to feel overwhelmed, angry, even numb at times. I keep thinking I should have known, I admitted. Should have seen something in Evelyn. Should have protected Liam somehow. That's a common reaction, but it's not realistic. Evelyn Carter fooled everyone: doctors, lawyers, the FBI. She's a practiced predator who specifically targets intelligent, successful people. Your son wasn't weak or foolish for being deceived by her. But I'm his mother. I should have. Being a mother doesn't give you supernatural powers of perception, Mrs. Harris. It makes you human, with all the limitations that entails. She leaned forward. The fact that you uncovered the truth, that you fought back despite everything Evelyn did, that's extraordinary. Most people in your situation wouldn't have managed that. We talked about the upcoming legal proceedings, about how to prepare myself for the psychological impact of testifying. It won't be easy, Dr. Patel warned. Evelyn's defense team will try to discredit you, to paint you as a confused elderly woman with a vendetta against her daughter-in-law. You'll need to be prepared for that. I'm tougher than I look, I said. I don't doubt that for a moment, but being strong doesn't mean you have to face this alone. I'd like to recommend ongoing therapy, at least through the trial period. Before she left, Dr. Patel gave me a referral to a trauma specialist near Willow Creek. And Mrs. Harris, whatever happens with the trial, whatever justice looks like in this case, remember that healing is a separate journey. Don't put your life on hold waiting for legal proceedings to make things right. The next day, I was discharged from the hospital. Sheriff Morrison insisted on driving me back to the cabin, which had been thoroughly cleaned by an FBI forensic team. They'd removed all traces of the poison and swept for any additional surveillance devices Evelyn might have planted. We found 3 bugs, Morrison informed me as we drove. 1 in the kitchen, 1 in the living room, and 1 in your bedroom. Evelyn was monitoring everything you did. The thought made my skin crawl, but it also explained how she'd known to return so quickly after I'd found the documents in the shed. The FBI shared some of their file on Evelyn with me, Morrison continued. It's quite a story. She grew up in poverty in Detroit. Abusive father, mother who worked 3 jobs and was rarely home. By all accounts, she was brilliant, full scholarship to Michigan, then MBA from Wharton. Started working for a financial consulting firm that catered to wealthy clients. That's where she found her victims, I guessed. Morrison nodded. She has a type: successful, intelligent men who are somewhat isolated. Men who achieved a lot but maybe missed out on personal connections because they were so focused on their careers. Like Liam, I said softly. My son had thrown himself into his work after his father died, building his company from nothing, often at the expense of his personal life. The FBI profiler believes Evelyn sees these men as stand-ins for her father. She seduces them, marries them, then slowly destroys them, enjoying their confusion and suffering before finally killing them. We pulled up to the cabin, which looked different in the bright afternoon light, less threatening, somehow, despite everything that had happened there. You sure you want to stay here? Morrison asked. You could come stay with Martha and me until this all blows over. Martha was Morrison's wife, a sweet woman who taught 2nd grade at the local elementary school. The offer was tempting, but I shook my head. I need to do this. Frank, I need to reclaim this place. Make it mine instead of a symbol of what Evelyn did. He helped me inside with my few belongings, then handed me a small box. The FBI asked me to give you this. It's a panic button system if anything happens. If you feel unsafe for any reason, just press the button and both my department and the federal agents will respond. After Morrison left, I wandered through the cabin, seeing it with new eyes. The space that had felt like a prison now represented something different: my son's final act of love. His attempt to protect me by giving me something valuable that Evelyn wouldn't immediately recognize. In the bedroom, I found the photographs I'd unpacked before everything happened. The one of Liam at Willow Creek, proudly holding his fish, had been placed on the nightstand. I picked it up, tracing his smile with my finger. I'm going to make this right, I whispered to his image. I promise. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings, medical follow-ups, and gradual healing. The chelation therapy to remove the remaining thallium from my system left me exhausted, but each day I felt a little stronger. Agent Ramirez kept me updated on the case's progress. Evelyn had hired a high-powered defense team, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. My recorded confession, combined with the FBI's surveillance and financial records showing her pattern of behavior across multiple states, had created an airtight case. She's trying to negotiate a plea deal, Ramirez told me during one of his visits to the cabin, offering to give up names of others in her network in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. Will the prosecution accept? They're considering it. A trial would be lengthy, expensive, and potentially traumatic for the families of all the victims. If we can get her to admit to everything and identify her accomplices, it might be worth taking the death penalty off the table. I thought about it, about what justice for Liam would look like. What would happen to her, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, in a federal supermax facility? She'd never see the outside world again. Part of me wanted her to face the death penalty, to experience the same fear and helplessness she'd inflicted on Liam and her other victims. But another part, the part that remembered the mother I'd been, who had taught Liam about compassion and justice, recognized that such vengeance wouldn't bring my son back. If that's what it takes to make sure she can never hurt anyone else, I can accept that. I said finally. Ramirez nodded, seemingly relieved. There's something else you should know. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit has been tracking the money Evelyn and her associates have stolen from their victims over the years. They've recovered over $50 million so far, including nearly $3 million that Evelyn siphoned from Liam's accounts. What happens to that money? It will be returned to the victims' families. In Liam's case, that means you. There's also the matter of the cabin and the mineral rights. Since we've proven that the will read at Thornton's office was fraudulent, Liam's true wishes will be honored. The mineral rights. With everything that had happened, I'd almost forgotten about Blackstone Energy's offer. $50 million for land that Evelyn had tried to sell for a mere $100,000. Have you thought about what you'll do with the property? Ramirez asked. I looked around at this cabin, which I'd slowly been renovating. New windows had been installed, the porch repaired, the interior painted in warm, welcoming colors. What had once been a dilapidated structure was gradually becoming a home. I think I'll keep the cabin, I said. Sell the mineral rights, but keep enough land around the house to maintain my privacy. This place was Liam's gift to me. I want to honor that. Ramirez smiled. I think he'd be proud of that decision. Later that evening, sitting on the newly rebuilt porch with a cup of tea, I watched the sunset over the forest. For the first time since Liam's death, I felt a sense of peace. Not happiness, I wasn't sure I'd ever feel pure happiness again, but a quiet acceptance of my new reality. The sound of a car approaching broke my reverie. I tensed instinctively, but relaxed when I recognized Sheriff Morrison's cruiser. "Evening, Rebecca," he called as he made his way up the porch steps. "Thought you might want to hear the news in person." "What news?" Evelyn took the deal. Full confession, names of all her associates, details of each murder. In exchange, she gets life without parole instead of the death penalty. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It's over, then. The legal part, yes, though the actual sentencing won't happen for a few more weeks. He sat in the chair beside me, his expression thoughtful. How do you feel about it? Relieved, mostly. I didn't want a long trial, having to relive everything in court. Morrison nodded. The FBI will still need your testimony for the sentencing phase, but it won't be as intensive as a full trial would have been. We sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "You know," Morrison said eventually, "Martha and I were thinking. It's been a while since we had a proper neighborhood gathering. Once all this is behind you, maybe we could host a little welcome party. Help you meet some of the folks around here." The gesture touched me deeply. "I'd like that. Frank, thank you." After he left, I remained on the porch, thinking about community, about belonging. For weeks, I'd been focused solely on survival and justice. Now, with Evelyn's confession, I could begin to think about living again. The next morning, I called Blackstone Energy and arranged a meeting with their representatives. 2 days later, I sat across from their executives in a conference room in town, listening as they explained their offer for the mineral rights. Mrs. Harris, the lead negotiator, a woman named Jennifer Walsh, said, "Our original offer to your son was $50 million. However, subsequent geological surveys have revealed that the deposits are even more extensive than we initially believed. We're prepared to offer $72 million for the mineral rights, with a guarantee that all extraction activities will remain at least 1 mile from your cabin." $72 million. More money than I could comprehend. I thought about what Liam would want me to do with such a fortune. "I have some conditions," I said. Walsh raised an eyebrow. "We're listening. First, I want ironclad environmental protections in the contract. Any damage to the local ecosystem must be immediately remediated at your expense. That's reasonable. Second, I want a percentage of the profits to be allocated to a scholarship fund in my son's name, the Liam Harris Foundation, for students pursuing degrees in technology and innovation." Walsh made notes. "We can certainly incorporate that into the agreement. And finally," I continued, "I want a commitment that a portion of the jobs created by this project will go to local residents. This community has struggled economically for years. They deserve to benefit from the resources on their doorstep." The negotiation continued for hours, but by the end of the day, we had an agreement that satisfied all parties. As I signed the final papers, I felt a strange mix of emotions: grief for what I'd lost, pride in what I'd accomplished, and a cautious optimism for the future. That night, I dreamed of Liam, not as the successful businessman he'd become, but as the gap-toothed boy with the fish, laughing by the creek behind the cabin. In the dream, he looked at me with those clear, kind eyes and said, "You did it, Mom. You made it right." I woke with tears on my cheeks, but they weren't entirely tears of sadness. For the first time, the memory of my son brought comfort rather than just pain. The day of Evelyn's sentencing arrived with a cold, clear morning in late autumn. The federal courthouse was an imposing structure of granite and glass, filled with the hushed conversations of lawyers, witnesses, and family members of other victims. I sat in the front row of the gallery, dressed in a simple navy suit that had belonged to my professional wardrobe in a previous life. Agent Ramirez sat beside me, providing quiet explanations of the legal proceedings. When Evelyn was brought in, I felt a jolt of recognition mixed with revulsion. She was dressed in a beige prison jumpsuit, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, all glamour stripped away. Without the designer clothes and perfect makeup, she looked smaller, almost ordinary. But when her eyes met mine across the courtroom, I saw the same cold calculation I'd witnessed in the cabin. Even facing life imprisonment, Evelyn Carter remained unrepentant. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair and penetrating eyes, called the court to order. The proceedings began with a recitation of the charges: 4 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Then came the victim impact statements. Family members of Alexander Green, Marcus Wilson, and Jason Chen spoke about the men they had lost, about the devastation Evelyn had wrought in their lives. Their stories echoed my own experience: the shock, the disbelief, the gradual realization of betrayal. When my turn came, I walked steadily to the podium, feeling the weight of all eyes upon me. I had prepared a statement, but as I looked at Evelyn, sitting there impassively, I set the paper aside. "My son, Liam Harris, was 38 years old when he died," I began, my voice stronger than I had expected. "He was brilliant, kind, and trusting, qualities that Evelyn Carter exploited and ultimately destroyed. But what she didn't destroy, what she couldn't touch, was the essence of who he was." I described Liam's life, his achievements, the people he had helped, the legacy he had left behind. I spoke of the hole his absence had created in my world, a void that could never truly be filled. "I don't speak today seeking vengeance," I concluded. "No punishment can bring back my son or ease the pain of his loss. I speak to ensure that Evelyn Carter never has the opportunity to inflict this suffering on another family, and I speak to honor Liam, who even in his final days fought to protect me and to expose the truth." As I returned to my seat, I felt a strange lightness. I had said what needed to be said. I had stood for my son. The judge then addressed Evelyn directly, her voice like steel. "Ms. Carter, before I pronounce sentence, do you wish to make a statement?" Evelyn rose gracefully, her hands folded before her. "Yes, Your Honor." She turned slightly, addressing not just the judge, but the entire courtroom. "I have admitted my guilt and accepted the consequences of my actions. I have provided the authorities with information that will help prevent future crimes. Beyond that, I have nothing to say to this court or to the families of the deceased. No remorse, no explanation, no humanity. Just a calculated performance designed to fulfill the letter of her plea agreement while offering nothing of substance." The judge's expression hardened. "Very well. Evelyn Carter, having pled guilty to multiple counts of first-degree murder and related charges, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served at the Federal Medical Center. Carswell." The gavel fell with a finality that echoed through the courtroom. As Evelyn was led away, she turned one last time, her eyes finding mine. There was no fear in her gaze, no regret, just a cold emptiness that sent a chill down my spine. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements from the victims' families. I declined to speak, allowing Agent Ramirez to handle the press. "Justice has been served today," he told the assembled microphones and cameras. "Evelyn Carter and her network have been dismantled, their assets seized, their victims remembered. The FBI would like to express our gratitude to the families who cooperated with this investigation, particularly Mrs. Rebecca Harris, whose courage and determination were instrumental in bringing this case to its conclusion." Later, as Ramirez drove me back to the cabin, he shared something that hadn't been mentioned in court. "The psychological evaluation of Evelyn revealed something interesting. She has a complete lack of empathy, what we would classify as malignant narcissism with antisocial tendencies. But there's more to it than that. She specifically targeted men who reminded her of her father. Her father, a successful businessman who abandoned the family when Evelyn was 12. According to her sealed juvenile records, she tried to poison him before he left. At 12 years old," Ramirez nodded. "It was ruled an accident at the time, but looking back, it fits the pattern. Each of her husbands represented a surrogate for her father's successful men she could control, punish, and ultimately destroy. And Liam fit that profile. Unfortunately, yes, your son's success, his intellect, even his physical appearance matched her preferred victim type. The knowledge didn't make Liam's death any less painful, but it did help me understand the randomness of it. Liam hadn't done anything to deserve what happened to him. He had simply had the misfortune to cross paths with a predator who saw in him the perfect target." "What will happen to her accomplices?" I asked as we neared Willow Creek. "Hutchkins and Foster have also taken plea deals. They'll serve between 15 and 20 years each, depending on their level of cooperation. The broader network, the doctors who falsified records, the lawyers who helped with the fraudulent wills, they're still being rounded up. This case has opened up investigations in multiple states." As we pulled up to the cabin, now barely recognizable with its new roof, fresh paint, and landscaped yard, Ramirez handed me a folder. "This is for you, the victim compensation paperwork. Between Liam's recovered assets, the mineral rights sale, and the Federal Victims Fund, you're entitled to substantial compensation." "I don't want money," I said quietly. "I want my son back." Ramirez's expression softened. "I know, Mrs. Harris, and I wish more than anything that we could give you that. But the money can help you build something in his memory. Something that might bring a little meaning to this tragedy." After he left, I sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the forest in shades of gold and crimson. The folder lay unopened beside me. What would I do with all that money? What purpose could it serve as darkness fell? I thought about Liam, about the kind of man he had been. He had always believed in helping others, in using his success to create opportunities for those less fortunate. Perhaps that was the answer. The Liam Harris Foundation would not just be a scholarship fund, it would be a comprehensive program supporting young entrepreneurs, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds. It would fund research into detecting and treating heavy metal poisoning. It would advocate for stronger protections for the elderly and vulnerable. It wouldn't bring Liam back. Nothing could do that. But it would ensure that his legacy lived on in ways that reflected the best of who he had been. And perhaps, in building that legacy, I might find a way to move forward, to create a life that honored my son's memory while embracing whatever time I had left. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Not happiness, not yet, but a quiet resolution, a determination to live fully despite everything I had lost. I thought of Dr. Patel's words about healing being a separate journey from justice. She had been right. The legal proceedings were over, but my path toward healing was just beginning. Tomorrow, I would start making calls, setting up the foundation, planning for the future. Tonight, I would allow myself to remember Liam as he had been, not as Evelyn's victim, but as my beloved son, the gap-toothed boy with the fish who had grown into a man of compassion and integrity. And in that remembrance, I found not just grief, but gratitude for the years we had shared, the love we had known, the bond that even death could not break. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.